One of the, I guess, arguably big diplomatic developments in 2015 was the normalization of relations between the United States and Iran, or let's say partial normalization of relations. What kind of an impact is that going to have on the Middle East?
Huge ripple effect, especially concerning two countries, Israel, which is not a fan of the U.S.-Iran deal, and Benjamin Netanyahu, if you remember in the United Nations, at the epic 45-second stare-down of the entire General Assembly, showing his displeasure. Already we've seen rifts with the United States that have been long simmering, especially over when it comes to the Palestinian conflict, the occupation. But even within American Jewry and Israeli Jewry, you know, this divide over whether or not we as Jews, they say, should support this deal. So already you have schisms with Israel and America. Secondly, and a lot of people might be surprised with this, Saudi Arabia, which is having its own Cold War, but actually a very warm, hot, real war with Iran for regional dominance. Specifically, we're seeing it with Yemen right now. They want their type of Sunni dominance over this, and they think anything that normalizes relations with Iran, makes it a player in the international scene, brings it closer to their ally, the United States, actually threatens them. So right now, we're gonna see this ripple effect, but for the world, the fact that there's even a partial diplomacy between the United States and Iran over this deal, the fact that sanctions might be lessened for Iran, and the fact that there might be more transparency over the nuclear ambitions of Iran and a cap on it, is actually a remarkable, some would say even historic occurrence in our lifetime.
All right, Philip, looking where this deal could go, does this sort of détente between Washington and Tehran mean, or finally signal, that this is going to be the end of Washington's attempts to isolate Iran?
No, most certainly not. We've actually heard some at the end of 2015. There were new attempts on behalf of Republicans in Congress to reimpose sanctions, or rather not having those sanctions lifted. That is, of course, part of the nuclear deal with Iran, and that would lead to some kind of a normalization of ties. I think the term is still a little bit optimistic because we're looking at separate issues here. The nuclear deal seems to be working out, but then you see at the end of the year ballistic missile tests on behalf of Iran, and that then has a reaction in the US Congress on behalf of Republicans. So you see a very quick counter-reaction on behalf of Republicans, and they are the ones who could still get in the way of what might turn out to be some kind of a normalization of ties. Because if you can get a nuclear deal sorted out between the United States and Iran, other things could be next. We're not looking yet at the opening of embassies, for example. Here in Washington, D.C., every time I walk or cycle past the old Iranian embassy, it's an amazing sight. It's just an empty building, and one of the most beautiful there are on Embassy Row. We're not looking yet at a reopening of that embassy. But I suppose for most of us, it's almost one of the good news stories of 2015. It's diplomacy that worked out.
Pepe, what did you make of the Iran nuclear deal?
Well, I was there. I spent 9 days in Vienna in the last stretch. I had very good access to the Iranian delegation. It was fascinating to compare what they were passing to us and what we were getting from the Americans and from the French especially. There was more bickering among the Westerners than between the P5+1 and Iran. In fact, the Iranians, their position was clear from the beginning. And they were going to leave with a deal, but a specified deal, and especially the end of sanctions. And it was, from the beginning, a completely manufactured crisis. They didn't have a nuclear program. They have sketches of what could be a nuclear program up to 2003. In terms of Iran being back in the West radar, if not for the US, what they are concentrating on is Europe, because they want European investment in their energy infrastructure, essentially $180 to $200 billion over the next few years, and then they can start seriously thinking of exporting energy to Europe. And this is what Europe wants, essentially.
Guan, there is a political newspaper here in Washington. It's pretty influential. It's called The Hill. It focuses on politics in Congress. And they reported that we sometimes forget the role that China played in those talks between the Western powers on the one side, and then China, of course, and Iran. And in fact, at one point, when the talks got bogged down, it was China that came forward with a plan to redesign one of the reactors that Iran owns, and that was seen as a breakthrough. Was China also seen as a more credible force during those talks, an honest broker, if you like?
Well, yeah, no, I think there are two things China hold very dear to their heart. One is non-proliferation. because, in the past few years, we saw China's reactions towards North Korea versus South Korea. Chinese president and South Korean president met multiple times. The South Korean president even showed up on the Tiananmen Square for the military parade. And whereas China's relationship with North Korea allegedly has been very cold, and China has been a very staunch supporter of non-proliferation as when it comes to North Korea, when it comes to Iran. And secondly, the one thing China holds very dear is non-interference in other countries' affairs. So in this case, when IAEA, or international organization, intervenes, that has support of six-party processes, China is for it.
Philip, let's come back to this hemisphere, the other big diplomatic breakthrough, normalization of relations between Cuba and the United States. How will that change U.S. foreign policy in Latin America?
I'm not sure it'll have that big an influence. Cuba really is the example that sits aside all the other Latin American countries. After all, this was really the big exception in terms of U.S. foreign policy. After all, it was in contact with every other country in Latin America. So that wasn't necessarily the problem. But this does show, again, that U.S. diplomacy over 2015 has worked wonders. And I think John Kerry, the U.S. Secretary of State, was being discussed even as a potential laureate of the Nobel Peace Prize. Maybe after President Obama got it a little bit too early, they thought maybe not another member of the Obama administration. But this has essentially worked out, and you saw the White House has a great sense of timing, as it always has done in terms of communication. It announces the fact that commercial flights will restart between Cuba and the United States on the exact day where 1 year ago, US President Obama and Raul Castro had that phone conversation, and they announced in the White House, on the US side at least, that they were looking towards this normalization of diplomatic ties. But we're not quite there yet, because when you say that things are going well with Cuba, well, not entirely, because they know very, very well that the trade embargo is in place and that it's incredibly difficult to get rid of it, because the reality for President Obama remains that the US Congress is controlled by Republicans, and they do not want to get rid of this embargo. So we're not looking at all at a full restoration of diplomatic ties, or a full normalization, rather. These are two very different terms. So the trade embargo will always be that big obstacle that remains, and it does look like it will remain for a long, long while to come still.
Wajahat, some success with Cuba, some success with Iran, but that other big conflict, the dispute, the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians.
Oh, that conflict.
That conflict, yes. Business as usual this year.
Business as usual. And, I think what Philip was saying, that John Kerry initially wanted to hang his hat on that conflict and say, yes, I made some inroads and maybe I got my Nobel, but it seems that the partial victories, at least we can agree on, with the US-Iran and US-Cuba will deflect the utter failure that we've witnessed for the past 60 years, some would say even more than 60 years, 40 years since 1967, about what's happening with the conflict. It's an occupation, it's persisting. The government of Israel, everyone would say, has gone far more right. Even the right-wingers of Israel has gone far more right, become more isolationist. Settlements have increased. Palestinian lives are more miserable. We still have incompetent, corrupt leadership of Palestinians. Arab nations aren't helping. And specifically, going back to the previous point of the US-Iran deal, it has, again, deteriorated the relationship between the United States and Israel. And of course, back and forth, we still help them with arms. We still help them, with diplomacy. We still help them with funding. But at the same time, it is this lingering, if you will, cancer, this open wound that is not only affecting Israelis and Palestinians, but also the region, and also, we live in a globalized world now, America.
And it was the Middle East, after all, that did get President Obama his Nobel Peace Prize ahead of time. It was an encouragement to get something done. He was supposed to be the president who'd be able to maybe solve some problems in the Middle East between Israelis and Palestinians. I think we can now safely say he completely failed. I mean, the White House has pretty much given up on anything on that front for now.
Right. Okay, let's end this review by talking about the next big story, the big story next year, 2016. And let's go through the panel. Pepe, let's start with you. What's the next big story?
Syria, definitely, because this is full spectrum dominance against resistance. The resistance is the 4+1, which is, let's say, an embryonic possibility of an alternative coalition to solve, or at least try to solve problems. That is not NATO. So full spectral dominance and NATO against the 4+1. And behind the 4+1, maybe in the long run, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is going to be closer and closer together. So the 4+1 is like a test for a possible intervention future by the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in international problems. The big story is going to be Syria, because if we don't solve Syria, Iraq will continue to be destroyed. The Sykes-Picot, as we already know, it's gone.
Philip, the next big story.
I think Pepe is right. It's probably going to be Syria. But when you say 2016, I only think of one thing, because I cover US politics and it's the presidential election. Right. We could see in November of 2016 the election of the first female president, after all, to the White House, or of Donald Trump. So that would probably be the biggest story of 2016. For me personally, I'll be watching a lot of soccer, because it's Euro 2016, which is being organized in France. And so I'll be busy for a month of 2016 watching soccer exclusively. So that's my big story.
There's a man with the right priorities there. Wajahat.
Piggybacking, yes, Syria conflict, how we deal with ISIS, the refugees, 2016 elections, but also I think, unfortunately, mass shootings and what I call asymmetrical urban warfare, what we saw in Paris, what we saw in San Bernardino, lone radicals. These type of shootings, I think, will increase. I think, unfortunately, they will become the norm. And how we respond to it, going back to your initial question, how we start off this conversation, how we as nations and the international community respond to what is now going to be the norm, unfortunately, I think will be the lingering story of 2016. And also, the last thing I want to say is race relations in America heading up to the 2016 elections. Black Lives Matters, especially right now when race relations are at their lowest ebb. It's really sad right now if you look at the polls. How will this fracture the country, and or how will the United States come together with its values to be the best version of itself? Really fascinating for me.
Guan, what's going to be the big story next year?
Well, for me, China is where I was raised and born, so what happens there, politics there is always fascinating. For one thing, I will be looking at if China's economy's growth model in the past really ran out of gas, and how it can really restructure its economy and keep the growth rate going. And also, let's not forget, 2017 will be a crucial political event, that is China's 19th Party Congress, where a new generation of leaders will emerge after Xi Jinping. So who will sit on the 7-member permanent membership of the Politburo Standing Committee of the CPC? That's really something that people are fascinated about.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's all we have time for, but the conversation continues online. We want to know what you think of the biggest story of 2015. Which, in your view, was that story? And what's on your mind as we head into the new year? Share your thoughts with us on our Facebook page. We're at facebook.com/CCTV America. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.